For decades, the way we've tried to understand mental health has been by looking at symptoms from the outside. But what if we've been looking at the problem, well, kind of backwards? There's a new approach taking shape, and it shifts the focus from our behavior to the brain's actual wiring. So, let's dive into this huge shift and see what it means for the future of mental health.
To really get what's changing, just think about this. If you go to the doctor with appendicitis, your diagnosis is super clear. It tells you the location, the appendix, and the problem, inflammation. It points right to the cause. But then you look at something like depression. The diagnosis is basically a checklist of symptoms, sadness, fatigue, and so on. It describes what you're feeling, but the why? That's still a huge question mark.
And that right there is the heart of the problem. It's been a massive roadblock for psychiatry for so long. See, if we're only treating the symptoms, just scratching the surface, we're not getting to the root of what's actually going on. To have treatments that really, truly work, you've got to understand the source.
Okay, so if just looking at symptoms isn't cutting it, where do we look instead? Well, the answer is to start seeing the brain less like a mysterious black box and more like an operating system, one we can actually start to map out and understand.
And the key that's unlocking this new way of seeing things is a field called computational neuroscience. Just think of it like this. It's a way to create a detailed map of the brain's internal wiring. Scientists can now model the patterns of electricity flowing through different networks of neurons, which gives us this incredible, unprecedented view of how the brain actually works. And this leads to a really mind-blowing question. What if mental disorders aren't just these vague collections of symptoms we see from the outside? What if they're actually specific, measurable disturbances in specific brain networks? This is the central idea of a new approach called neuroanalysis.
So if we're saying that these disorders are really network problems, then the next step is pretty obvious, right? We've got to start mapping them. The goal here is to pinpoint exactly where in the brain circuits the problem is happening for each different condition.
And here it is, the whole framework in one place. Now, I know this looks like a lot, but check this out. On the left, you've got the major disorder groups we all know. The next column links each one to a specific brain network. Then it tells you the type of problem, the dysfunction. And finally, and this is absolutely crucial, it assigns a specific timescale to each one. This is our new roadmap for figuring out what's going wrong, where it's going wrong, and even the speed at which it happens.
Okay, that table was a lot to take in. I get it. So let's really break it down piece by piece. We'll start with that first row, psychosis and schizophrenia.
So for these conditions, the problem seems to be in the executive network, which is what runs all our higher-level thinking. The specific dysfunction? It's a problem with connectivity, either too much or too little communication between neurons. And just think about that timescale for a second. Milliseconds. That's literally the speed of thought and perception. It makes perfect sense when you think about the experience of a hallucination or a delusion, right? It feels instantaneous because it pretty much is.
All right, so that's psychosis, happening at the speed of thought. But what about something totally different, like the much slower rolling waves of mood disorders like depression and mania?
For mood disorders, our focus shifts to a totally different circuit, the salience network. The thinking here is that our mood is a result of how well this network optimizes or balances the brain's energy and resources. When that optimization process goes haywire, you get the long cycles of depression or mania. And look at the time scale, weeks to months. It lines up perfectly with the typical cycle of these episodes that people experience.
Okay, so we've seen millisecond glitches and cycles that last for months. But what about those deep-seated patterns that are shaped over an entire lifetime? That brings us to personality disorders. These conditions seem to be tied to the default mode network, which you can kind of think of as our sense of self network. It's most active when we're reflecting internally. The dysfunction here isn't a short-term glitch. Instead, it's about how the network has been physically shaped by a lifetime of experiences. That's what scientists call experience-dependent plasticity. So of course, the timescale for this is lifelong. It's a reflection of a person's entire story. And this timeline just drives the whole point home, doesn't it? For the first time, we can start to tell these major categories of mental illness apart, not just by their symptoms, but by their fundamental speed. From the lightning-fast glitches of psychosis to the weeks-long cycles of mood, all the way to the lifelong shaping of personality. So, having this incredibly detailed new map of the brain is amazing, but it brings up the most important question of all. What can we do with it? How does this actually help people? Well, it gives us a brand new blueprint for treatment. Suddenly, the approach to treatment becomes incredibly logical and precise. First, you identify which network isn't working right.
Step 2, you can target the most important hubs within that network. And step 3, you tailor the treatment to match the specific timescale of that disorder. We're moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach and toward true precision medicine for the brain.
And this is where it starts to sound like science fiction, but it's real. This opens the door for powerful, precise interventions like neuromodulation. Imagine combining a medication that helps the brain be more open to change with targeted electrical stimulation aimed directly at the faulty circuit. We're talking about the potential to literally help the brain wire itself.
What we're witnessing here is nothing short of a revolution in how we think about, diagnose, and ultimately treat mental illness. This is the beginning of the neuroanalytic era. But you know, a revolution that stays in the lab doesn't help anyone. It has to make it to the clinic. And right now, there is an urgent need for psychiatrists and therapists to get up to speed on this, because the science is moving at an incredible pace.
So, how do you bridge that massive gap between the research lab and the doctor's office? Well, one really cool idea being floated is a neuroanalytic agent, basically a smart tool designed to help educate clinicians and translate all this complex brain data into practical insights that can actually use with their patients.
And all of this leaves us with one final, powerful question to think about. After all these years of relying on descriptive labels, what does the world look like when we can finally diagnose and treat problems in the brain with the same biological precision we use for the rest of the body? The potential is just staggering.